I'm going to share with you the secret to keeping your Phalaenopsis orchid flowering for 30 weeks of the year. Yes, this is entirely possible if you know the tips and tricks I'll share in this video, as well as avoiding the major pitfalls that means your blooms wither and die within only a couple of weeks and never return. And stay tuned till the end because I've got a great tip on how to get a fresh set of blooms after the current flowers have faded. Your Phalaenopsis orchid should bloom for between 6 to 10 weeks at a time. We can easily make this 10 weeks by following some basic care principles. The problem for this popular plant is that it's often misunderstood. Folks without much interest in orchids or houseplants in general buy these in the shops because they look so gorgeous, take them home, and when they finish flowering after a few weeks they think it's dead and lob it in the trash. I mean, to be fair, it does look like a zombie of the plant world when there's no flowers on it. And let me know in the comments if you've actually done this. Go on, be honest. I know I've done this before I knew anything about plants. So obviously, the orchid doesn't die when it stops flowering. It isn't an annual. Instead, it goes into a dormant rest period of a couple of months before going into bloom again. Our goal then is to prolong the flowering period as much as possible to allow us to have 3 cycles of 10-week blooms a year. And that's easily done when you know how. Hopefully. As with pretty much all flowering plants, orchids require as much bright indirect sunlight as possible. If you've heard this term before and struggle to understand what it actually means, then something that has really helped me out a lot in the past is to look at how much of the sky the plant can see. If it can see plenty of the sky, but direct afternoon sunlight never touches it, then you're good to go. If the view of the sky is obstructed by, the ceiling and other bits of furniture, or even trees in the garden, that it's not getting enough light. Please don't stick yours in a windowless downstairs toilet like I've seen in many a restaurant. They really won't last that long. You equally want to avoid giving this plant any rays of direct afternoon sunlight. It will be too much for it and the blooms will wither and die. I do find though that a few hours of early morning sun can be a good thing. It's much kinder to the plant. I keep mine in front of my east facing dining room where it gets about 4 hours of early morning sun a day, and it's very happy, with blooms regularly opening up. If you struggle for light in your home and you want an orchid paradise to be proud of, then I'd seriously consider supplementing with grow lights. Check out my link to Sansi in the description for some awesome grow lights and a 15% discount on all orders. Get the lighting right and your orchids will be happy to bloom for up to 10 weeks. Something that's confused me about orchids in the past is knowing exactly what the heck they are, and this is something that trips a lot of people up. You'll notice that yours is planted in a very chunky potting mix made primarily of bark. This is because orchids are actually epiphytes, a type of plant that grows on the bark of trees from which it absorbs its moisture and nutrients. They don't live in soil in the ground like your philodendrons or tradescantias. Put yours in some soil and you won't have a happy flowering orchid for long. So they live in a super chunky potting mix of bark that does not retain water in a significant way, meaning we have to keep an eye on the watering for this plant. All this means is that we usually have to water it weekly to prevent the roots drying out and the flowers dying off. Check the potting mix of your orchid. If it's dry, then it's ready for a drink. If it's wet at all, then leave it another few days. You can also check the roots to see how thirsty it is. Generally, a hydrated orchid will have plump green roots. As they start to dry, they become lighter in colour, almost silvery. The lighter they are, the thirstier they are. Take your plant over to your sink and saturate the roots thoroughly and multiple times, getting everything soaked. It will seem like the bark dries too quickly, but there will be enough moisture in there for the roots to draw what it needs until you water it again next week. This might be a bit alien to you if you've never owned an epiphyte before, but you just have to trust the process and be confident that the roots are drawing up all it needs from the bark. Resist the urge to water every couple of days. This will lead to root rot and your blooms will quickly evaporate. If you can, try watering with room temperature water when your orchid is in flower. The shock from cold water being poured onto the roots can stunt the plant and it will soon lose its blooms. This also means not using ice too. They won't like the cold. I normally recommend bottom watering on this channel, but in this case you only want to top water. Having the roots sat in water will be the worst thing for it. They'll turn black and mushy and seriously damage the health of the orchid. When you do water your orchid, then try not to splash water onto the leaves or crown of the plant. This will lead to rotting issues in the centre and its eventual downfall. Orchids grow from the bark of trees, so they naturally hang at an angle. And this means that any rainwater that is collected in the crown is able to run off and dry much quicker than in our homes. And the breeze in the great outdoors also helps here, something we don't have in our homes. For the best orchid health, you need to make sure you feed it regularly. You'll probably be watering near enough every week, and to give your orchid the nutrients it needs, I recommend adding feed every month. An all-purpose houseplant fertilizer will be good enough. You often see specific orchid feeds in the shops like Orchid Focus or Baby Bio Orchid Feed, but this is only a nice to have. These feeds tend to have a little bit more nitrogen than your all-purpose ones, which is good for healthy shoots and leaves, but doesn't do anything to lengthen the life of the blooms. Feeding regularly will mean that new shoots will appear in good time after the plant's rest period. Just add the feed to the water as you irrigate the pot. The nutrients will be absorbed into the bark and made available for the roots. To get your orchid to continually cycle its blooms, you need to check its roots aren't outgrowing the pot it lives in. The roots can grow pretty quickly and soon take over the pot. When they completely take over, it's a good idea to change the pot and refresh the potting media. But don't repot whilst the plant is flowering though. This only stresses it out and will likely shorten its flowering stage. Wait until it has finished flowering completely, assess the roots and change the pot if needed. And like I mentioned earlier, don't think about potting yours up into compost or soil. They really don't like this and the next batch of blooms will be delayed. They naturally grow on bark in their habitat, so we need to mimic this as much as possible in our homes. Choose a super chunky potting mix made primarily of wood bark and you'll have a happy orchid. So what's the deal with those clear plastic pots these plants always come in? Essentially, this is mimicking their natural habitat again. Like I say, they naturally grow on tree trunks in the jungle, so their roots are attracted to natural light. Put them in a terracotta pot or black plastic nursery pots, and they'll soon throw a strop and stop sending out their flowers. Unlike the roots of other plants, orchid roots have a special tissue called velamen that covers the root surface. Velamen is made up of dead cells and is porous, which allows it to absorb moisture and nutrients from the air. Exposure to light helps stimulate the growth of velamen, which helps the roots absorb moisture and nutrients more efficiently. And velamen can also photosynthesize, which means it can produce energy from the light. This process helps supplement the energy needs of the orchid. Keeping them in decorative pots is fine so long as there is a gap for the light to get in between the plastic and decorative pots. That's what I do with my orchids. You generally don't want to touch the roots of your orchid whilst it's flowering, but during their rest period, it's a good idea to check the health of the roots. These plants are particularly sensitive to damaged roots. If anything looks black and mushy, then simply cut it out. Phalaenopsis orchids are native to tropical Asia and northern Australia, so they don't experience cold temperatures, the lucky things. This means we should protect them from the cold, especially when they're flowering. And this starts when we buy the plant in the first place. If it's cold outside, make sure the shop assistant wraps it up somewhat to protect it from the worst of the cold on the way home. A sudden change in temperature for an unprotected orchid will kill the flowers. When you do get your orchid home, you want to avoid placing it next to heating or cooling vents. The temperature shifts will do no favours for it. Your aim is to keep it in a range of 16 to 24 degrees Celsius during the flowering stage. Anything above this and the flowers will start to wilt. Below 16 degrees Celsius and the bloom cycle will be cut short. When your orchid is in its rest period, it won't necessarily be detrimental for nighttime temperatures to drop below 13 degrees Celsius for a couple of weeks, and this can actually encourage it to start blooming. But please, don't start putting ice cubes on the soil to try and trick it into blooming. You risk shocking the roots and doing unnecessary damage to the plant. Here's a little bit of a hack when it comes to purchasing Phalaenopsis orchids. You'll always find these plants in full bloom in the shops, that's why so many people are sucked into buying them. But the trick is to buy one that still has a few unopened bulbs. You see, this plant doesn't open all its blooms at once. They come out staggered like drunks exiting a pub at closing time. This way you know it's not right at the end of its blooming cycle, it still has some legs. If you buy one where all the bulbs are fully open, you have no idea how long the flowers have been opened and how long they have left. It's just a little trick to help you get a nice long bloom cycle to start with to avoid disappointment when they only last a couple of weeks. Pruning is one of the most important things you can do for your Phalaenopsis orchid to prolong its flowering stage. Most folks wait for the blooms to fade and then chuck the plant in the bin thinking that it's the end, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Not only are you missing out on new blooms in a couple of months' time after its rest period, you're also probably missing out on a fresh set of blooms on the same flower spike. Yes, it's quite normal for a flower spike to grow fresh blooms in the same flowering cycle if you know what you're doing. So once all the flowers have dropped off the flower spike, take a close look at the stem. You're looking for the next viable leaf bud down from which a new spike will develop and give you many more weeks of flowers. So locate the top of the spike and follow your eye down until you find a leaf bud that hasn't had a flower spike develop from it before. And this is crucial. Once a bud has developed flowers, it won't grow a new spike. You need to find the next green bud down. If a stem is brown, then keep going until you find a green bud. Once you find this, make a cut just above with a sharp pair of snippers, place the plant in a bright spot and wait and see if a new spike develops. And don't be too disappointed if this doesn't happen, because a new spike won't always grow. You'll just have to wait until after its rest period when the plant will send out brand new flower spikes when it's ready. If the whole stem is brown, then unfortunately it's done for. Cut the whole spike off just above the leaves and wait for its rest period to finish. The good news is that Phalaenopsis orchids are not particularly fussy when it comes to humidity. The aim of the game is to keep them in an area that doesn't drop below 40% humidity, which should be possible for most of us unless we live in a particularly arid climate. Whatever you do though, don't mist these plants with a spray bottle in the hopes of giving them humidity. This really won't increase air humidity around them, it will only damage the flowers, creating mold problems and shortening their life. The only real option for upping the humidity in a room is to use a dedicated humidifier and having it on for most hours of the day. Using pebble trays filled with water and misting regularly really doesn't do anything to increase air humidity, and I talk about this and a few other popular houseplant myths in this video, so click on the link to check it out.